Hello and welcome back to the YouTube channel of Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley. I'm Pastor Gervais Charmley, and in this video we're continuing a series on Staffordshire churches with a particular reference to the Staffordshire Moorlands at the moment. This is the Church of St Bartholomew, Butterton. It's rebuilt in about the middle of the 19th century, although there has been a church here, we know, at least since the 13th century and probably earlier than this. We're up here in the Staffordshire part of the Peak District. It's an area that in the past people made their living here by mining and sheep farming. It's very rural, very picturesque. We're here on a rather dull November morning, and to be honest, rather dull mornings like this are more common in this part of Staffordshire than the more exciting weather, bright sunshine, etc. Very often all you can see from these elevated villages is the inside of a cloud, at least again this time of year. This is, Butterton is one of what is known as the thankful villages. These are the villages where none of the men who went away to war in the Great War died. They all came home. And the same is true of Butterton in the Second World War. So there is no war memorial here, because, at least not to those who died, because nobody did. Instead, there are memorials of thanksgiving that all the boys who went off to war came home safely when the war was over. Well, let's explore this interesting, as I say, mid-19th century church, and we'll see some of the few relics that survive from the previous building. All right. So here we are inside at Butterton. The church, as we see it today, was built in 1873 with a spire being added in 1879. It's a fairly typical building. I mean, 1870s, most church architects in England are working on the idea the 14th century is the best era in church history in terms of architecture. They have this idea that church architecture works in a kind of organic model, which really is kind of a fallacy. It's not just kind of a fallacy, it is a complete fallacy. And that you have early English, and this is just sort of getting going, it's kind of adolescent, if you will. And then you have, allegedly, the 14th century, the so-called decorated style, as the full age, full vigour, and then the late 14th, 15th century, what's known as the perpendicular style is seen as it's all getting a bit old and decrepit. Well, that's nonsense. Architecture develops not in a kind of, not in that kind of organic fashion. It is that it changes over time as people really perfect methods. But the idea that there's kind of this decay in the perpendicular period is nonsense. It's really just, as I say, the organic fallacy. Well, we'll have a look around. It is quite a nice building in terms of this Victorian Gothic, this imitation 14th century. I just want to complain about my view of what the architects in this period got wrong. You can see we've got these open-backed benches, very typical, and again, it's imitating the Middle Ages. It's this kind of setup was the kind of seats were quite popular with the Anglo-Catholics because it goes away from the box pews of the 18th century, and the idea is that, we're going back to the Middle Ages, kind of. Well, why do we need to go back to the Middle Ages? Why do we not go forward? But again, we do have here a memorial. This is not a war memorial. This is a memorial to those who were lost, trying to rescue a young man who had fallen into who had gone down a disused mine shaft and then got into trouble. So Joseph Wood, Roland Cantrell and William Hambledon descended to try to save Joseph Shenton, and in 1842, and in fact all of them were killed, and the rescuers went down. Now, I'm sure that Joseph Shenton wasn't intentionally endangering his life, but it just reminds us about the dangers of potholing and that kind of thing, and don't do it unless you know what you're doing and you're well trained and have a good rescue plan. We are the pulpit. Originally the top panels would have been partially open, but you can see they've been blocked off. For some reason people don't like having their stomachs shown by the pulpit. I can't understand why, of course I can. We've got here this rather interesting stone curb that has the lectern attached to it and then leads up to the pulpit, which I think is an interesting feature here. Here we have a memorial to the Reverend R.J. Crump, M.A., for 39 years Vicar of Butterton, who died on April the 5th, 1953, aged 85 years. This is still that era when ministers on the whole didn't, well, certainly Anglican clergy didn't retire very much. They tended just to carry on until the end of their days. The east window is the restoration of St. Peter. You can see the disciples getting off the boat, and there's St. Peter with the keys and St. Andrew with St. Andrew's cross behind him, indicating who he is. This is one of the things to remember about these stained glass windows and this sort of ecclesiastical art, that very often these symbols will be included so that the people looking at them can understand, yes, this is who we're looking at, this is what we're looking at. So it's really there to assist understanding. We have a simple communion rail on wrought iron supports. The chairs here, they look to be 17th century, which is quite good. Well, that chair is. These are later. A great big church Bible there. We are literally just after Remembrance Sunday, hence the poppies on the communion table. A bit of stained glass here, and this is more figurative, more decorative. But looking at it, it looks like what's happened is at some point these windows have been broken and fragments of what was originally there has been put back in with plain glass. We have here the Reverend William John Williams, that suggests he was a Welshman, for 15 years Vicar of Butterton, who fell asleep on the 9th of May 1897, aged 61 years. Here we are looking west. You can see you've got the tower arch. There's a modern kitchen, toilet and stuff behind there. There's the organ. And here we have a memorial to the Reverend William Richardson, incumbent of Butterton and Wancote, who departed this life March 27th, 1834, aged 72 years. And it's not unusual, as I said, for vicars to go on until they died, because there was no pension. So even if the vicar couldn't actually do his job, he would say, and there's a pretty awful case in a Worcestershire church where the vicar, aged 50, after only 11 years in office, suffered a really nasty fall from a horse, which resulted in serious brain damage, which left him unable to speak and with his mobility severely impaired. And he was the rector, there was no disability pension, so he had to stay in office even though he couldn't actually communicate. He's extremely disabled. And he stayed in office for 50 years because he died aged 100. You can see why it is that clergy pensions, disability pensions, are a jolly good idea, because the alternative was you had your rector would stay in office disabled and he'd have to pay a curate to do the work, and it didn't help anybody really. Here we have again, most of the monuments here are to clergy, so here's the memorial to the Reverend Augustus Good of Vicar of Butterton, Rector of Grindon, 1954 to 1958, died on the 10th of April 1958, aged 63 years. Got a copy of Holman Hunt's Light of the World, very common, very popular. Now here is a memorial. Butterton near Leek is a poster rather. This records the foundation stone of the church being laid on Thursday the 6th of July 1871, 1:30, by the Right Honourable Earl of Shrewsbury and Talbot. And this is a photograph, well, this is a painting rather, of the church before it was rebuilt. Very typical, obviously it was rebuilt quite largely in the 18th century because it's a very typical 18th century church. You can see one, I've done a video in fact on one down at Calden, and another one at Waterfall, and there's a similar one which has all been extended to the east rather, down at Warslow. So this is, and there's another one at Wancote which is never open to the public. So, but this is a very typical 18th century Staffordshire Moorland church. The small tower, the nave with those windows. Now the suggestion probably that you're looking at least parts of that would have been medieval, but it's clearly had a rebuild in the 18th century when those windows were introduced. Here's the roll of honour. This is the men who all returned safely, as it says at the bottom. And it wasn't a small number. Both wars, you've got two columns of those who went out and came back. Now here we have some of the men of Butterton who joined the forces. There they are in the Great War. The men who came back. The men who went out and the men who came back, and it wasn't because they didn't risk their lives, but they were spared while others were not, and so the village is thankful indeed. Now at the back here we have something that some American viewers may recall from in horror. It's the banner of the Free Foresters Lodge. Now you say, isn't that Freemasonry? No, it's not Freemasonry. The Foresters, it's one of these fraternal orders, and really what they existed for was for fellowship among men, and also they provided unemployment insurance and health insurance and this kind of thing for members. And this is the reason why a lot of them fell out of existence in the latter part of the 20th century, because what comes in then is the welfare state. We've got the NHS, we've got proper unemployment insurance and such like. So these organisations don't need to exist anymore because their function for providing help for men who became unemployed or were disabled or needed to pay the hospital bills, that goes away. And the Foresters, there's nothing religious about it. It is a friendly society for people, for men to help one another, support one another. And yes, they had their fellowship, as it were, their social events, but it was really, it's the friendly societies are not Freemasons. They do some of the things that the Freemasons did in terms of helping one another, but the whole point of the friendly societies is this doesn't have to have a sort of quasi-religious element to it. And finally we come to the font. This is, well, I say finally, almost finally, we come to the font. This is the oldest thing in the church. This is 13th century. You can see it's a octagonal, somewhat rough, carved with tracery on the panels. It's a fairly common design in this part of the world in that period. But it's a very good example, and it's good that it's survived all these years. Now here we have the organ. The organ. Now the organ has a pedal board. It is, let's see if we can see, it's currently locked, but I think it is a double manual. It's 2 manual. It's got 8 stops, and we find here it's from Hill and Co. Organ Builders to Her Majesty, 1846. So this organ is older than the church. It was presented by the Queen Victoria Diamond Jubilee Commemoration Committee, 1898. Now that again tells us that it's second-hand. They wanted an organ to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria. They didn't have the money to buy a new one, so they bought a used one. And why not? You want an organ, if you can't get a new one, you can always get a refurbished one. So that's the inside here at Butterton. Let's go outside and have a look around there. Well, so here we are outside Butterton. And you can see here this magnificent Victorian Gothic building, very much this imitation 14th century style, with your little your fairly long chancel but quite narrow, your nave then, and then you've got the west tower with its spire. And as I say, the spire is a later addition, it's a few years afterwards. The church is 1873, the spire is 6 years later, 1879. The spire's added, and it becomes a massive landmark. You can see, not on a day like this when it's a bit foggy, but you can see, on a clear day, you can see the spire for miles around, because we're up on a hill here at Butterton. So let's have a further look around the outside of St Bartholomew's. Well, here we are now. Obviously we've got to lift it up a bit to look at the spire. You can see this nice slender spire, again imitating the 14th century. You've got a weathercock on top, your traditional weather vane, and of course it's named a cock for the cockerel, nothing to do with anything else. Americans, please take note. It's not a big church because it's not a big village. It's a village of a very reasonable size, but it's not enormous. Across the road is the village pub, the Black Lion, and it's quite typical of an English village, of course, to find the church and the pub in close proximity. And the pub in the English village is supposed to be not a place of dissipation, but a place of warmth and fellowship. Also, it would have been the inn for travellers who visited the area. So we've got quite an extensive graveyard, a lot of these big Victorian gravestones commemorating. Here we've got John Hambledon. The Hambledons were one of the leading families here. And as you go through, we see the same names appearing again and again, because of course this is a small country village. This is a village where people lived for generations. This is an 18th century gravestone, and quite elegantly carved here, because you have got some quite skilled stonemasons up here in the moorlands. There we are, there's the church. You can see here the aisle on the north side here, and the north aisle has these larger windows, because as you can see, as you saw from inside, it can actually get quite gloomy here in the winter, and so we don't want just little windows here. We want to get a reasonable amount of light inside the building. And here we have one of the more impressive memorials. This is to James Burnett of Clayton House, Butterton, second son of Thomas Burnett of Wancote Hall. So in these important families we've got here these Victorian ones, and one of them has this medieval style grave slab on top. So this is you can see this is the field that's just by the church, and we look back here, and there's Butterton Church in all of its quite significant Victorian Gothic glory. There's some evidence that some of the original of the stone of the previous building was reused here. That would make perfect sense. You don't want to waste good building stone just because you're rebuilding. Well, we'll have to say a few words in conclusion, and that'll be the end of this video. So here we are, Butterton, the doubly thankful village in the Staffordshire Moorlands, and its magnificent Victorian Gothic church. This was a period, of course, as I've said before in other videos, the Victorian period, the period of great confidence in the Church of England. We're moving forward, and there are forward movements, this kind of thing going on, and this kind of church reflects that confidence, because this is a tiny village, but the church, although it's scaled for the village, the spire, the architecture, it all says this is important. It's not as grand as nearby Grindon. I hope to go to Grindon at some point. It's not open at the moment. Grindon is known as the Cathedral of the Moorlands. It's even more impressive than this. It's got a spire too, but the rest of the architecture is 14th century going to seed almost. This is a sort of plain of 14th century Gothic, a structure that is much more in accordance with what actually 14th century church out here would have looked like. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy these videos. I enjoy going out and making them like this. It can be a bit of a challenge sometimes, as get in the fog and all that, but it's good to be able to share some of, particularly here, the area where I live, with other folk, even around the world. So thank you for watching, and may God bless you and keep you.